You ever realize the exact second your entire life stops looking like what you thought it was? I didn't. Not until I was standing under crystal chandeliers in a downtown Chicago hotel ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water I barely touched, while everyone around me laughed like I didn't exist. My name is Jack Harrison, 42 years old, software logistics consultant, the kind of job people misunderstand until they need what I build. That night, I wasn't there for business. I was there because my wife, Emily Carter, insisted it would be good for appearances if I showed up to her company's annual investor gala. Emily worked at Meridian Dynamics, one of those mid-tier tech firms trying to punch above its weight, always talking about growth curves and market positioning like she was born into boardrooms instead of marrying into a quiet, steady life. I remember stepping into the venue and feeling immediately out of place, not because I didn't belong in a suit, but because I could feel the room deciding I didn't belong in anything more than the edges of it. People were already laughing before I even reached Emily's table. I saw her across the room, flawless in a deep navy dress, surrounded by colleagues who looked like they'd rehearsed their confidence in mirrors. She didn't wave. Not at first. She just gave me that polite smile she used in public, the one that never quite reached her eyes anymore. A man from her team, someone I later learned was named Chloe Adams, leaned over and said something that made the group chuckle. I caught fragments of it. Something about support staff and guest seating. Words that didn't need translation to feel sharp. I didn't react. I've learned over the years that reacting is often just another way of losing control. So I just adjusted my cufflinks, took a slow sip of water, and nodded like I hadn't heard anything at all. That's when Emily finally walked over. She didn't take my arm. She didn't introduce me properly to anyone. She just said, "You made it," like I was late to an obligation instead of arriving to my own marriage being displayed under glass. Around us, the conversation kept flowing, glasses clinking. Laughter rising and falling like tides I wasn't part of. Someone mentioned performance metrics. Another person bragged about a promotion, and I stood there absorbing the subtle truth that nobody here was going to ask me a single question about myself. Not tonight. Not ever. Emily stayed close, but not near, like proximity was a legal requirement she wanted to minimize. I noticed the way her coworkers looked at her when she spoke, like she was slightly above them, and then the way they looked at me, like I was slightly below. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I had been in worse rooms, harder negotiations, more uncomfortable silences. But something about this silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was directed. A little later, I excused myself toward the bar area just to reset, just to breathe somewhere I wasn't being measured. That's when I heard Chloe again, louder this time, laughing about how some people really do marry into soft landing jobs. A few people laughed with her. Not maliciously, just carelessly, the way people laugh when they assume the target won't hear or won't matter. I turned slightly, just enough to confirm what I already knew. Emily heard it too. She didn't correct them. She smiled instead, a small, controlled smile, like she was choosing convenience over conflict. I remember thinking how strange it was that silence can sometimes feel heavier than confrontation. I checked my watch, more out of habit than necessity. 10:42 p.m. somewhere in the back of my mind. I was already calculating how long it would be until I could leave without making it look like I was running away. That's when Emily's voice cut through the noise behind me, light and performative, saying my name like she was introducing me rather than acknowledging me. I turned back toward the center of the room, unaware that in less than an hour, every assumption in that space about who I was and what I meant to her would begin to shift in ways none of them were prepared for, least of all Emily herself. The room kept moving around me as if nothing had changed, but I could feel the shift beginning in ways no one else had noticed yet. Conversations continued in soft waves of confidence and casual superiority, glasses still lifted, laughter still flowing, but now every sound felt slightly more distant, like I had stepped half a foot outside of the world everyone else was standing in. Emily returned to her circle of coworkers, slipping back into their rhythm without hesitation, as if I was just a pause in her evening rather than part of her life. I stayed where I was for a moment longer than necessary, watching her posture change the second she rejoined them, shoulders straightening, voice gaining that polished corporate tone she reserved for people she wanted to impress. Chloe Adams leaned in again, saying something that made two executives laugh, and I noticed Emily smiling along without resistance, like alignment with them mattered more than alignment with me. I had seen this version of her before, but never this openly. It was subtle at first, a shift over months, then years, a gradual transformation I had convinced myself was stress or ambition or simply the weight of a demanding career. But standing there under those lights, I could finally see the shape of it clearly, like a photograph coming into focus after being blurred for too long. I walked slowly toward the edge of the ballroom, not leaving, just observing, letting distance give me clarity. The city lights outside the glass walls of the hotel stretched across Chicago like a grid of possibility, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a place so structured could feel so chaotic inside. I checked my phone out of habit. No messages, no urgency, just the quiet confirmation that I was physically present but socially unanchored. Back inside, Emily had begun speaking with her manager, a man named Richard Blake, whose presence always seemed to command attention without effort. He was talking about quarterly projections and investor confidence, words that floated through the air like currency I was not invited to spend. Emily laughed at something he said, a little too quickly, a little too practiced, and I felt something tighten in my chest that I could not immediately name. Chloe noticed me watching from across the room and raised her glass slightly in my direction, not as a gesture of welcome, but more like acknowledgement of someone who existed outside their narrative. I gave a polite nod in return, the kind of response that requires no emotion. That was when I overheard the first real fracture in the evening. Chloe, speaking just loudly enough for me to catch, said something about how interesting it was that Emily kept things grounded despite her circumstances, followed by a laugh that carried just enough edge to land differently than intended. Emily did not correct her. She did not defend anything. Instead, she simply said, "Jack understands," as if I were a concept rather than a person standing 10 feet away. I remember how calmly she said it, and how that calm felt heavier than any insult could have. I stepped closer again, not to interrupt, but to observe the dynamic more clearly. There is a difference between being included and being tolerated, and in that moment I realized I had been confusing the two for a long time. Richard Blake excused himself to greet another table, and Emily briefly turned her attention toward me. For a fraction of a second, I thought she might actually introduce me properly, might bridge the gap that had been widening in plain sight. Instead, she simply said, "Are you okay over there?" as if I were physically distant rather than emotionally excluded. I nodded once. "Yes," I said. It was simple, controlled, and it ended the conversation immediately. She seemed satisfied with that answer and turned away again, back into her environment where she was efficient, admired, and fully understood. I stayed still for a moment longer, listening to the rhythm of the room, noticing how naturally I had been pushed to the periphery without anyone explicitly asking me to move. That was when the announcement about the evening program began, signaling the transition from networking reception to formal presentation. Lights dimmed slightly. Attention shifted toward the front of the ballroom, and I watched as Emily straightened once more, preparing to perform the version of herself that belonged here. I took one final glance across the room, noticing how easily everyone settled into their roles, and I began to understand that what was unfolding tonight was not just a social event, but a structure of hierarchy I had never fully recognized until I was already standing outside of it. The announcement voice echoed across the ballroom, smooth and rehearsed, signaling the transition into the next segment of the evening program. But I barely registered the words at first because my attention was still anchored to the subtle architecture of the room itself. People shifted positions with practiced ease, aligning themselves toward the stage area where Meridian Dynamics leadership was preparing to speak, and I could feel the entire environment tightening into something more formal, more performative, like a theater about to begin its main act. Emily moved with them, stepping slightly forward with her team, adjusting her posture in a way that suggested she was preparing to be seen rather than simply to exist. I stayed near the edge, not hidden, not engaged, simply present in a space that no longer required my participation. That was when Chloe Adams glanced back at me again, this time with a small smile that carried more confidence than before, as if the earlier jokes had established a permission structure I was expected to accept. I did not respond. Instead, I watched Emily lean toward Richard Blake as he spoke quietly to her, his expression calm, his tone unreadable from where I stood. There was a brief moment where Emily's eyes flickered toward me again, almost reflexively, but she turned away before any acknowledgement could settle between us. The lights dimmed further as the first speaker approached the podium, and the room's attention consolidated into a single focal point. Applause began politely, then softened into silence as introductions were made. I listened without moving, absorbing names, titles, projections, all the language of institutional confidence that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the world Emily had fully integrated into. It struck me then how naturally she inhabited this space compared to me, how easily she adapted to its expectations, how effortlessly she could shift between personal life and professional performance without visible friction. The speaker began outlining company performance metrics, expansion plans, and investor confidence, each phrase carefully structured to reinforce stability and growth. I noticed Emily nodding at the appropriate moments, her expression controlled and attentive, her presence aligned with the room in a way that felt almost rehearsed, though I knew it was simply habitual. I took a slow step back toward the perimeter again, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I was beginning to understand something about positioning that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with relevance. As I stood there, I recalled fragments of conversations from earlier months, small dismissive comments Emily had made about my work, about my quiet career, about how I preferred stability over ambition. At the time, I had interpreted those remarks as harmless differences in perspective, but now they felt like early indicators of a growing divide that I had failed to acknowledge. The applause rose again as another executive was introduced, and I watched Emily join in, her hands clapping in rhythm with the rest of the room. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing overtly wrong, and yet the accumulation of small moments was beginning to form a pattern I could no longer ignore. I checked my watch again, a habitual gesture that no longer served any real purpose, and I realized that I had been standing in the same general position for several minutes without anyone needing or expecting anything from me. That realization was strangely clarifying. Around me, conversations resumed in quieter clusters during the presentation, investors leaning toward colleagues, executives exchanging brief remarks, the room functioning like a network of controlled signals and responses. Emily was now fully engaged in her environment, occasionally leaning toward Chloe or Richard Blake, contributing small comments that seemed to carry weight within their circle. I remained outside of it, not excluded by force, but by design. The speaker concluded his segment, and polite applause filled the room once more. As the sound faded, I noticed Emily finally glanced toward me again. Longer this time, as if assessing something she had previously overlooked. She did not approach, but the look carried a brief uncertainty that had not been present before. Then she turned away again, rejoining her colleagues as if nothing had shifted. I stood still, watching the room reset itself into motion, unaware that the next announcement would begin a chain of events that would slowly dismantle every assumption built into the evening so far. The room had fully settled into its formal rhythm now, the kind of structured calm that only exists when an audience agrees to follow the same focal point at the same time. The executive presentation continued at the front of the ballroom, numbers and projections flowing across a large screen, each slide reinforcing the company's sense of control and forward momentum. I remained near the outer edge of the crowd, no longer trying to integrate into conversations that had already decided I was irrelevant, instead observing how easily people surrendered their attention to whoever held the microphone. Emily was closer to the center now, positioned with her team in a way that suggested importance, her posture straight, her attention fixed forward, occasionally nodding at key phrases as if affirming alignment with every strategic point being made. Chloe Adams stood slightly behind her, whispering something to another colleague, then glancing briefly in my direction again, this time with a subtle expression that felt less like curiosity and more like expectation, as if I was part of a narrative she assumed had already been written. I did not respond to it, but I noted it. The speaker at the podium transitioned into a discussion about upcoming partnerships and organizational restructuring. And I remember thinking how often words like restructuring sound neutral in public, but carry entirely different weight in private rooms where decisions are actually made. Emily leaned toward Richard Blake again during a pause in the presentation, and he responded with a short nod before returning his attention forward. There was a sense of quiet coordination between them that was professional on the surface but carried the familiarity of long-established alignment. I shifted my position slightly, now closer to a column at the edge of the room, not hiding, but no longer in the direct flow of attention. From there, I could see the entire composition of the ballroom more clearly, the way clusters formed around influence, the way laughter rose and fell in calibrated patterns, the way proximity to leadership subtly defined status. Emily's laughter broke through once during a brief comment from Chloe, and although it was light and natural, I noticed how quickly she returned to a composed expression afterward, as if even amusement had to remain within controlled boundaries. The presentation continued with references to expansion strategies and investor confidence metrics, and I realized that most people in the room were not listening to every word, but rather waiting for cues that signaled when to react, when to applaud, when to shift focus. That realization made the environment feel less like a gathering and more like a synchronized system. I checked my phone again, not because I expected anything, but because it gave me something to do with my hands while my mind processed the structure unfolding around me. There were no notifications, no disruptions, just silence from the outside world reinforcing the quiet isolation inside the room. Emily glanced back again, this time holding her gaze slightly longer when she saw me near the column. It was not a dramatic moment, not something anyone else would have noticed, but I caught the micro-expression on her face, a brief hesitation that suggested she was recalibrating my presence within her perception of the evening. Then she turned back toward the front as the speaker concluded another segment, and applause rose once more. I did not join in immediately, but I followed the rhythm after a second, matching the room just enough not to stand out, though I no longer felt part of its meaning. As the applause faded, a new figure approached the stage to introduce the final portion of the evening program, and I could sense a subtle shift in attention throughout the room, a tightening of expectation as if something more significant was about to be revealed. Emily straightened again, her focus sharpening, and Chloe stepped slightly closer to her, both of them now oriented toward the stage. I remained still at the edge, watching the alignment of bodies and attention converge toward a single point, unaware that the next announcement would begin altering the structure of everything I had observed so far in ways that would no longer allow anyone in the room to maintain the same assumptions they had carried into the evening. The final introduction to the evening program began with a shift in tone that even people not paying close attention could feel immediately, a subtle change in cadence from celebration and networking into something more structured, more consequential. As the executive on stage adjusted his posture, and the screen behind him faded into a new slide marked with corporate branding and a simplified phrase about future direction. I remained at the edge of the ballroom, still anchored near the same column, observing how the room collectively adjusted its attention without any visible signal beyond the speaker's change in tone. Emily had moved fully into the central cluster now, standing closer to Richard Blake and a few senior leaders, her expression composed but noticeably more focused than before, as if she understood that what was coming required her full attention. Chloe Adams was still nearby, but her earlier confidence had shifted into something slightly more restrained, her body angled toward the stage rather than toward the people around her. The speaker cleared his throat and began speaking in a more deliberate rhythm, introducing what he described as a strategic evolution of meridian dynamics that had been in development for several months, language carefully chosen to sound both inevitable and reassuring. I noticed a few heads in the room tilt slightly, a subconscious adjustment that happens when people begin to sense that general information is about to turn into specific impact. Emily glanced toward Richard Blake briefly, then back to the stage, her hands now still at her sides instead of gesturing or reacting, a small but noticeable change in her physical composure. The speaker continued, explaining that the company had entered into advanced discussions regarding structural realignment with a larger holding entity, one that would provide expanded capital access and global operational integration. The phrasing was intentionally vague, but the weight of it settled across the room in a way that made casual conversation impossible. I could see people slowly stop whispering, stop checking phones, stop shifting in their seats. The environment was narrowing into a single point of attention. Emily's expression remained neutral, but I could see a slight tightening around her eyes, the kind of micro-reaction that appears when expectations begin to shift away from familiar territory. Chloe leaned closer to her and said something quietly, but Emily did not respond immediately. The speaker continued, now transitioning into what he called the announcement of partnership leadership, and the screen behind him changed again, this time displaying corporate logos and a timeline graphic. It was at that moment that I noticed a staff member at the edge of the stage quietly adjusting a tablet device, glancing between the screen and the room, as if confirming something that had already been decided elsewhere. The speaker paused briefly, then said the words that changed the atmosphere completely, stating that the acquisition process had been finalized earlier that week and that Meridian Dynamics would now operate under new executive oversight beginning immediately. There was a moment of silence that followed, not dramatic, but absolute, the kind of silence that occurs when people are processing information faster than they are prepared to react. Emily's head turned slightly toward Richard Blake, her expression shifting for the first time into something less controlled, not panic, but recalibration. Chloe stopped moving entirely, her earlier confidence replaced by stillness. The speaker continued, explaining that representatives of the acquiring entity were present in the room that evening to observe the transition and ensure alignment across leadership teams. I noticed several people in the room begin to look around more deliberately now, scanning faces, trying to identify who might belong to this unseen group. Emily's gaze shifted slowly across the ballroom, and for the first time that evening, I saw uncertainty replace her earlier composure. Richard Blake stepped slightly forward, as if preparing to respond or acknowledge the announcement, but the speaker continued without interruption, stating that the new ownership group preferred to remain discreet during public introduction, focusing instead on operational integration rather than ceremonial presence. That sentence created a ripple effect through the audience, as people began to realize that the most important individuals in the room might not be the ones standing at the front. I remained still at the edge, watching the shift in perception unfold in real time. Emily looked back toward her colleagues again, this time more slowly, as if reassessing the environment she had been confidently operating within only minutes earlier. The speaker concluded the announcement with a statement about continuity, emphasizing that day-to-day operations would remain unchanged for the time being, but the structure above them had fundamentally shifted. Applause began hesitantly, scattered and uncertain, as people tried to process whether celebration was appropriate or premature. Emily joined the applause after a brief delay, but her movements were no longer as fluid as before. I noticed her glance toward the perimeter again, briefly, and this time her eyes lingered a little longer than necessary, as if she was unconsciously searching for something she had not yet identified. The room slowly returned to a low murmur of conversation, but the energy had changed completely. People were no longer speaking with certainty, but with speculation. I stayed where I was, observing the recalibration of power and perception unfolding around me, aware that whatever came next would no longer follow the same assumptions that had defined the evening so far. The moment the announcement settled into the room, the atmosphere did not return to what it had been before. Instead, it stabilized into something more fragile, as if everyone was collectively aware that the structure they had relied on was no longer as predictable as it appeared only minutes earlier. Conversations resumed in low tones, but they were no longer casual. They were cautious, fragmented with speculation and uncertainty. I remained near the same column, still observing rather than participating, noticing how quickly confidence can dissolve when hierarchy is no longer clearly defined. Emily stood with her team, but her posture had changed subtly. Her shoulders no longer relaxed in the same way, her attention divided between the stage, her colleagues, and something else that had not yet been fully identified. Chloe Adams was speaking quietly to another executive, but her earlier sharpness had softened into something more measured, as if recalibrating her own assumptions about the environment. Richard Blake remained composed, but I could see him scanning the room in brief intervals, the way people do when they realize oversight is no longer purely internal. The speaker on stage concluded the formal portion of the announcement and transitioned into logistical reassurances, explaining continuity of operations and stability in leadership roles during the transition phase. But those words no longer carried the same weight they might have carried earlier in the evening. People were no longer listening for information alone, they were listening for implications. I noticed Emily finally break away from her group slightly, stepping a few feet toward the perimeter of the ballroom, her gaze moving across the room with slower intention than before. When her eyes passed over me, she paused for a fraction longer than she had earlier in the night, as if trying to reconcile my presence with the shift that had just occurred. It was not recognition in the dramatic sense, but something closer to reassessment, a quiet recalculation that did not yet have language attached to it. She did not approach me, but the distance between us felt different than it had before, less defined by social expectation and more by uncertainty. Around us, conversations continued to evolve, with small groups forming tighter clusters, people lowering their voices, occasionally glancing toward the stage or toward each other as if seeking confirmation of interpretations that were not yet stable. Chloe rejoined Emily briefly, speaking softly, but Emily responded with only a slight nod, her focus still divided. I observed how quickly professional environments adapt to new information, not through immediate understanding, but through gradual behavioral adjustment. The speaker concluded his final remarks and stepped away from the podium, signaling the official end of the formal segment of the evening. Almost immediately, the room began to shift again, this time toward informal interaction, but the energy had fundamentally changed. There was no longer a single shared narrative, only fragmented interpretations of what the announcement meant for each individual present. Emily turned slightly back toward her team, but I could see hesitation in her movement, as if she was no longer certain of the exact role she was meant to occupy within the group dynamic. I stayed in place, continuing to observe rather than engage, noticing how perception itself becomes unstable when authority structures are not fully visible. Richard Blake moved toward a small cluster of senior staff, speaking in low tones, his expression controlled but focused, and I noticed several people subtly orient themselves toward him, as if seeking anchoring in familiar hierarchy. Emily's attention shifted again, briefly toward me, then away, then back again, a pattern that suggested she was trying to reconcile multiple interpretations of the situation simultaneously. The ballroom lights remained steady. The music resumed at a low volume, and the event technically continued as planned, yet nothing about it felt unchanged. I could see that Emily was no longer fully embedded in her earlier confidence, and that realization seemed to create a gap in her usual composure that was not immediately filled by anything else. She stepped slightly farther toward the edge of the room again, and for the first time that evening, she appeared less like someone participating in a structured environment and more like someone evaluating it from within. I remained still, watching the subtle redistribution of attention and influence unfold around her, aware that the evening had moved into a phase where information was no longer simply received, but interpreted, and where interpretation itself would soon begin to reshape every assumption that had been carried into the room. The ballroom had settled into a new kind of instability, one that did not announce itself through noise, but through hesitation, as if every person in the room was now reconsidering what they believed only minutes earlier. Conversations were happening in fragments rather than flows, interrupted by pauses that suggested people were no longer fully confident in what they were saying. I remained near the same column at the edge of the space, observing how quickly certainty dissolves when the framework supporting it changes without warning. Emily was no longer standing firmly within her group. She had shifted slightly outward again, her attention divided between familiar colleagues and the broader room, as if she was no longer certain where her center of gravity was supposed to be. Chloe Adams stayed close to her, but even Chloe's tone had changed, less assertive, more observational, as if she too was adjusting to a new understanding of the environment they were still occupying. Richard Blake was engaged in conversation with two senior staff members, his expression controlled but noticeably more deliberate, the kind of composure that suggests awareness of broader consequences beyond the immediate moment. I noticed several small clusters forming across the ballroom, each one subtly reorganizing itself around perceived influence rather than assigned roles. The earlier hierarchy, which had felt invisible but stable, was now being actively reassessed in real time. Emily glanced toward the stage again, though nothing was happening there now except the quiet transition back to ambient music and the gradual winding down of the formal program. Her posture was still upright, still composed, but there was a new element in her stillness, something closer to calculation than confidence. She looked toward Chloe briefly, then toward Richard Blake, then across the room again. And for the first time that evening I saw a lack of immediate resolution in her expression. It was not confusion, in the traditional sense, but rather the absence of a clear reference point. I stayed in place, continuing to observe without interruption, noticing how people behave when they realize that the information they received is incomplete but still consequential. A few attendees began moving toward the exit area, while others remained in place, reluctant to act without understanding the full context of what had been announced. Emily did not move toward the exit. Instead, she remained within the central space, though slightly removed from her earlier position, as if unconsciously repositioning herself relative to something that had not yet fully revealed its structure. Chloe spoke to her again, and this time Emily responded with a brief nod, but her attention remained divided, her gaze occasionally drifting back toward the perimeter of the room. I could feel the shift in her perception even from a distance, a gradual erosion of certainty that had not yet been replaced by anything stable. Richard Blake finished his conversation and stepped away, walking toward another group, leaving Emily momentarily without the immediate professional anchor she had been relying on earlier. She paused, then adjusted her stance slightly, scanning the room again with slower, more deliberate movements. Around us, the ballroom was no longer operating as a single coordinated environment, but as a collection of smaller interpretations of the same event, each one slightly different from the next. I noticed how quickly people begin to reassign meaning when authority becomes distributed rather than centralized. Emily took a small step toward the edge of the room again, closer to where I stood, though still not directly approaching. Her eyes passed over me once more, lingering just long enough to suggest recognition that now carried additional weight compared to earlier in the evening. There was no dialogue between us, only the silent acknowledgement of presence in a space that was no longer as predictable as it had been. She stopped a few feet away, then turned slightly as if reconsidering her direction, and in that moment I could see the subtle tension between her previous confidence and the new uncertainty that had entered the structure of the evening. The music continued at a low volume. The lighting remained unchanged, and yet everything felt different because the assumptions underneath it had shifted. I remained still, observing the way she paused within that uncertainty, aware that whatever decisions followed would no longer be based on the environment she had entered earlier, but on the one that was now quietly forming around her. The space between us and the rest of the ballroom felt thinner now, not because anything physically changed, but because perception itself had shifted into something more unstable and deliberate. I remained near the edge of the room, still positioned by the same column, watching as the final phase of the evening unfolded into a quieter, more fragmented reality. People were no longer reacting to announcements or presentations, but instead reacting to each other's reactions, as if trying to confirm what was real through observation rather than information. Emily stood only a short distance away now, closer than she had been earlier, though still not directly engaging with me. Her posture remained controlled, but the subtle certainty she had carried at the beginning of the night had been replaced with something more measured, something that suggested she was continuously adjusting her understanding of the environment around her. Chloe Adams was still beside her, but her presence felt less dominant now, her earlier confidence reduced into careful attention, as if she was also recalculating her position within the group dynamic. Richard Blake moved through a nearby cluster of executives, speaking in low tones, his expression steady but focused, the kind of composure that comes when leadership is no longer about presentation but about control of interpretation. I noticed how quickly people adapted to uncertainty, forming temporary conclusions based on partial information, then revising them as new assumptions entered the room. Emily turned slightly again, her eyes scanning the ballroom in a slower rhythm than before, and this time her gaze lingered longer on the outer edge where I stood. It was not a dramatic recognition, but something quieter, more internal, as if she was noticing the absence of clarity rather than the presence of anything specific. She took a small step forward, then stopped, as if reconsidering whether movement itself was appropriate in a situation that no longer had a defined structure. Around us, the ballroom continued to thin out in density, with small groups beginning to drift toward exits or toward private conversations that no longer carried the energy of earlier interactions. The music played softly in the background, but it no longer functioned as atmosphere, only as continuity. I observed how Emily's attention shifted again, briefly toward Chloe, then toward Richard Blake, then back across the room, as if each reference point she had relied on earlier was now requiring reevaluation. There was a visible difference in how she held herself compared to earlier in the evening, not in posture, but in focus, as if she was no longer operating within a familiar framework, but instead navigating something that had not yet stabilized. I remained still, allowing the distance between observation and participation to remain intact, noticing how even silence becomes a form of communication when everything else begins to lose structure. Emily finally moved a few steps closer to the perimeter again, stopping at a point where she could see more of the room without fully entering any cluster of conversation. Her expression was composed, but there was a subtle tightening in the way she observed the environment, as if she was now actively searching for confirmation rather than simply receiving information. Chloe spoke briefly to her, but Emily's response was delayed, minimal, and absent of the earlier certainty that had defined her interactions. Richard Blake passed behind her at a distance, pausing to exchange a few words with another executive, and I noticed Emily's attention briefly follow him before returning to the wider room. The structure of the evening was no longer being dictated by formal announcements, but by residual interpretation, and that interpretation was no longer consistent across all attendees. I could see people forming different understandings of the same event depending on where they stood, who they spoke to, and what fragments of information they had absorbed. Emily remained near the edge of that shifting field of perception, neither fully inside nor fully outside of any group, as if her position had become temporarily undefined. I noticed her glance toward me again, this time holding for a longer moment than before, not with recognition alone, but with a kind of reassessment that suggested she was attempting to reconcile what she believed earlier with what she was now observing. She did not speak, and neither did I, but the silence between those moments carried more structure than any conversation that had occurred earlier in the night. Around us, the ballroom continued to empty in slow waves, leaving behind clusters of conversation that were increasingly isolated from each other, each one constructing its own version of understanding. Emily remained still for a moment longer, then shifted slightly as if deciding whether to remain or move. And in that hesitation, I could see the final traces of certainty from earlier in the evening beginning to dissolve completely into something that had not yet taken a defined shape. The moment I finally understood what was happening in that room, it was not because anything new was said, but because nothing needed to be said anymore. The structure of the evening had already completed its transformation, and what remained was only the aftermath of perception shifting into awareness. I stayed near the same column, still at the edge of the ballroom, but now even that distinction felt less meaningful, as if the entire space had flattened into a single field of observation rather than participation. Most people were no longer clustered in formal groups. They were leaving in small waves or standing in loose pairs, speaking quietly, their earlier confidence replaced with measured uncertainty. Emily remained nearby, no longer anchored to any specific group, her position now defined only by proximity to movement rather than belonging. She was still composed outwardly, but there was a stillness in her expression that suggested internal recalibration had reached its final stage. Chloe Adams stood slightly behind her, no longer speaking, simply observing the same room with reduced certainty, as if the shared assumptions they had entered with had dissolved without replacement. Richard Blake was farther away now, engaged in a final exchange with two executives near the exit corridor, his posture steady, but his attention no longer commanding the space the way it had earlier. I noticed how quickly authority disperses once it is no longer actively reinforced. Emily finally took a step toward the outer edge of the room, not toward me directly, but in my direction, as if drawn by proximity rather than intention. She stopped again a few feet away, her gaze moving across the room once more before settling briefly on me. This time there was no immediate dismissal, no practiced neutrality, only a quiet evaluation that had replaced all earlier assumptions. I did not move, and neither did she. The silence between us felt structured now, not empty. as if it carried all the missing context that the evening had not fully revealed until this point. Around us, the ballroom continued its slow dissolution, with attendees filtering out through wide doors into the hallway beyond, their conversations fading into softer fragments as distance increased. The lighting remained unchanged, but the perception of the room had altered completely, as if the environment itself was now secondary to what had been realized within it. Emily shifted her stance slightly, her attention no longer divided among multiple reference points, but focused more narrowly on the immediate space between us. There was a subtle change in her expression, not emotional in a dramatic sense, but reflective, as if she was reviewing earlier interpretations under a new understanding that had not yet been verbalized. Chloe stepped away from her position, moving toward another group near the exit, leaving Emily momentarily without her closest professional anchor. I observed how quickly dependency structures dissolve when external hierarchy becomes unclear. Emily's eyes moved across the room one more time, then returned to me, holding longer than before, not with surprise, but with something closer to reconsideration. She took another step forward, closing the distance slightly, then stopped again, as if testing the boundaries of a new reality that had not yet fully formed into definition. The ballroom behind her continued to empty, leaving fewer voices, fewer movements, and more space for silence to expand into. Richard Blake passed through the exit corridor, disappearing from view, and with his departure, the remaining structure of leadership within the room felt even less centralized. Emily remained where she was, no longer aligned with any group, no longer operating within the earlier framework of confidence that had defined her presence throughout the night. I noticed how her breathing remained steady, how her posture remained controlled, but also how her attention no longer had a fixed direction. It was distributed now, searching rather than asserting. The final attendees began to leave the ballroom entirely, and the sound of footsteps grew more distant, echoing faintly through the hallway outside. Emily and I were now positioned in the quietest part of the room, with only a few remaining conversations fading in the background. She looked at me again, and this time there was no attempt to interpret through assumption. The evening had already done that work for her. What remained was only acknowledgement of presence in a space where meaning had shifted completely. I stayed still, observing the final state of transition, aware that what had begun as a structured social event had concluded not with resolution, but with the quiet collapse of certainty itself.